Life hack, you can hire a random scholar and just pay them a few $1,000s to give you lectures. Like, that's sick as fuck. More people should do that.
Hello friends, Jess here from Z Club. Welcome to Season 3 of Building at the Edges. We host conversations with the top innovators, thinkers, and builders at the intersection of crypto and community.
Hey friends, Steph here. I'm filling in for Jess while he's AFK. I had the privilege to sit down with my friend, Toby Shorin. He's the co-founder of Otherinternet and author of the recent essay, Life After Lifestyle, which made many waves through crypto and was first previewed as a talk at FWB Fest earlier this summer. Toby thinks deeply about the role of moral influence in crypto, particularly our individual and collective responsibility as builders. As you'll hear in this conversation, it's a topic that we both think critically about, especially as people in roles of influence ourselves. This is a slightly different kind of conversation from what you might be used to on this feed, but if you're in the thick of the adventure of building an enduring internet-native organization, a DAO, a squad, a meta label, or even if you're just simply curious about what that means, I know you'll find something thought-provoking here. Let's dive in. Hey, Toby.
Hi, Steph.
How are you?
I'm great.
What's the thing you've been thinking about this weekend?
So, Otherinternet is becoming a nonprofit, and I am in the middle of fundraising for it. And
Whoa.
I'm trying to learn how to do that. And I've never done this before, even though lots of my friends have raised venture funding. So I'm getting lots of conflicting pieces of advice. It's all really good advice. I'm messaging tons of people, doing a lot of random looking into who works where and who I ought to talk to about this stuff and trying to make friends with people. Yeah, I'm trying to learn how to do it, right?
Yeah.
So honestly, that's consuming a huge amount of my mental space.
Yeah. Why a nonprofit? Why not any other legal wrapper or none at all?
Well, we've been a regular corporation up until this point. It's kind of hard to describe the way that we work to people because we are a pretty weird organization. It's sort of a research institution embedded in a squad. And the squad came first. So there are a lot of people with different interests, different energies and ways of working. And we started this Uniswap project a year ago and got a $1 million grant from Uniswap. A big part of what we have been spending our time on, in addition to that, is all of these different internal learning practices and facilitating other members of the squad to do their own research, some of which has nothing to do with crypto governance. That's really important for us to continue. That's the main reason Otherinternet got together. These set of people got together in the first place, was thinking together. So in order to grow that part of the organization, which is really who we are, we need to have resources that aren't contingent on us delivering client projects, I guess. Uniswap is not exactly a client per se. It's more like an ecosystem in which we are a governance actor and we try to take responsibility there. It's somewhat more constrained in scope. We could certainly grow out, I think, a very profitable kind of governance consulting business, governance, professional delegation business, if we would like to. My experience suggests that would change the flavor of the rest of the work that we're doing to be mostly in support of that. In reality, that's not really why we set out what we set out to do or why we got together in the first place. So it's important to have other sources of capital.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like you've shared a version of this tension with me before that it was one of those times I was like, what does Otherinternet actually do? And
everyone wants to know.
Everyone wants to know. I know. Yeah, it's the juicy question. But you were saying how Otherinternet does you do consulting, you do these governance. I mean, consulting feels like the word to use here. You were you were sharing that you're kind of over that. You're kind of trying to get back to something other than consulting. And when I hear you talk about you say that Otherinet's origin is this idea of a squad built around ideas. What does that look like beyond consulting?
This is definitely something that we are trying to figure out right now. So I think the first Otherinternet kind of collective practice was peer review. We had this idea, hey, blogger peer review this is a thing now. And anything that this group of people happen to be publishing, it's going to get posted to the blogger peer review chat first. And we're going to all look at it and review it. give qualitatively like really good feedback on it. And that kind of the first like squad collective authorship of practice. And then there are other things we have tried and developed too. Like we used some collective funds to hire a French Revolution scholar, basically, to give us some lectures about natural law theory and like different constitutional designs when we were thinking about public goods last year and like wanting to understand where the idea of the public came from. So that was another example of testing how this squad can learn together. And then another thing we did is we hired visiting researchers. We hired like 2 super young people right out of college to work with us and like develop a project of their own choosing. We kind of just added them to the squad and said like, hey, why don't you do this? And that became a really generative project, the basis for figuring out how the core staff, because they were almost the first employees of Otherinternet actually, like that became kind of the basis of figuring out how the core staff can then interface with other squad members and like kind of create these containers for them to do projects. And now, after almost a year of working together with a full-time team, as well as the squad, we have developed a sort of library of different formats for calls, different learning agendas, different types of ongoing cadences and rhythms and containers with starts and ends. And I think we're getting really close to figuring out how to straight up give people in the squad like discretionary budget to just do projects of their own choosing. That's like the energy we want to have. And it went away for a while when like the full-time staff came on board, because then we were like, oh, wait, we're an institution now. Like we got to be really professional. I think we're now figuring out how to create the affordances for people who are just in the squad to do the things that they want to do and be supported.
I mean, when you're talking about this idea of creating these squads and basically equipping them with budgets to go facilitate and explore their own ideas, I mean, that sounds like a DAO. Is it not a DAO?
Otherinternet is not a DAO.
Otherinternet is not a DAO. Why not?
Otherinternet is not a DAO. I think we resist this term because, at least I resist this term, because I don't like being wrapped up in like the semantic confusion around it. Too many things can be called a DAO. So I'd rather be something specific. Plus, I've had to fight really hard and like work an absurdly long time to have like this applied research institution become real. And so I'm owning that title for the work.
Applied research institution.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the things that we were thinking a lot about at Seed Club, and I think also just in the space, this idea of how non-specific the word or phrase DAO is. When you use the word applied research institution, you know, because there's always that tension between using the language that's available as a way to create familiarity and legibility for other people, or creating new language for the thing that is specific and speaks to what you're doing. And I see you all going that second route, sort of kind of creating this like, how does it feel to be on that side of it? Like, do you feel like you have enough legibility? I mean, is that ever a tension for you?
I think it is. I mean, research institution sounds pretty formal, doesn't it? Like that's where we are trying to create some credibility affordances. But for those who know, it's also possible to describe ourselves like as the squad, which is the thing that we came up with more or less. Or not that we invented that term, but we gave it this meaning. And it's good to walk both paths. I don't see too much of a tension between the two. Honestly, I think a lot of the work that we have been kind of doing in the crypto space specifically is playing with language that might want to be revitalized. Like when we did this public goods piece, the positive sum worlds, we thought public goods, the way it's being used is a somewhat impoverished definition. Like, why don't we attach it to like what public goods like really means in the real world, like as it currently stands? And then I think that there are other words in the crypto space that we are not so fond of, like protocol politicians or delegates, like I think have affordances that are not really useful or like not really helping DAOs professionalize, organize themselves. But we are interested in the concept of like public servants, for instance. I think we have done a little bit less of like creating our own language, our own words from scratch, and are playing more with the words that already exist but need to be revitalized or have properties that could be really useful for how people think and work if they were introduced in a new way.
When you were talking about public goods earlier, and you were saying how y'all had started working with this Renaissance historian.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just like, feels like such a classic Otherinternet story where there's this thing and you're exploring this thing and you're like, actually, let's like go way back and look at what is the history of this thing. And, you know, to me, it seems really obvious why that's important. But from your perspective, like, why do that?
First of all, it's rewarding to like learn as a group and like use resources like that. Life hack, you can hire a random scholar and just pay them a few $1,000s to give you lectures. Like, that's sick as fuck. More people should do that.
If that's the one thing you take away from this, that's what you should do.
For real. That's a huge life hack, dogs.
Yeah.
But then I think the other part is a lot of things that are happening in the crypto space are like echoes of themes, or like they're iterations on very old themes. There's a history of liberal thought. And when we talk about stuff like the network state or crypto states was like, the term before Balaji's book came out. He's not the first person to, come up with that comparison. Luis Cuende has been on that wave for literally years. What we're talking about is a moral impulse to create our own society where we can designate our own rules, where we can decide how it is we want to live. That's the liberal drive. And it's been with us for like a few hundred years, since the French Revolution, basically. So we wanted to look at the French Revolution specifically because that's where constitutional design was kind of first created. But secondly, or more broadly, there are a lot of things I think we can understand about this moment by looking at the historical variations, whether those are the tensions between the aristocracy and the nascent democratic movement in the UK right after the French Revolution happened, when democracy was still seen as like this kind of dangerous terrorist idea, or the tensions between different thinkers in like the 19th century who argued for the different kind of emphasis on like state, church, and like democratic or like labor involvement in setting like political agendas. There's just a lot to learn about like what is happening now and historical versions of the same political arguments that can be used to parse through some of the FUD and just like ideological gambiting that's happening at the current moment.
Why does it feel like we are really at the edge of this like big cultural revolution? Do you think it felt this way for people who were in that period of time, like during the French Revolution or during the Renaissance? Like, do you feel like they also felt this sense of we are on the edge of something? For actually, sure. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because they were fucking dying. Like, the French Revolution was just a huge massacre, which is why it was so controversial. Like, the people who were on the edge were literally like, guillotining aristocrats. Like, all the time. It was a war. It was a civil war.
Do you think that there's like a crypto v non-crypto war going on?
I think the banking sector is very unhappy about crypto and about like tech in general, and is doing a lot to entrench itself legally, protect its own interests. So I think that there's for sure a struggle over the nature of digital currency and digital financial rails. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a war, but yeah, I can understand why some people in the crypto space like perceive it like that.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there is this felt sensation in the crypto space, and I think in some ways in the DAO space too, that like, and I certainly experience this when I'm talking to non-crypto native friends or people, that I feel like a sense of great disconnection and just like almost unrelatability to that world. And then when I'm like with my like people who are in this world, there is just like great sense of solidarity. And obviously I've never been at war and have never survived a war, but like there is that sense of almost like fraternity or something with folks who are in the crypto space, and just like to kind of connect it to your like life after lifestyle essay, because this actually feels really relevant. Why does it feel that way? Why do you and I feel like we have so much solidarity, even though we barely know each other and like
I think because you're a real one. You talk straight talk.
There's no, yeah.
I get what you're asking though. Let me
yeah.
Think about that. I
I
don't
mean,
know.
you're
I mean, honestly, I don't know. I could speak for, the two of us, but I think that the kind of like we're all in this together, the feelings of solidarity are perhaps a little overblown. And I
mm,
expect that the 2024 election will reveal a lot of political fault lines that currently are being paper mache'd over.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry to be a downer about that, but
No, I think, and so maybe it's like a different, there is some, or maybe not. Maybe challenge me on that. Like, do you think that we have a shared culture in Web3, in crypto? Like, of course, there are these subcultures, and you've got DAOs, you've got DeFi, you've got NFTs, you've got even just like retail consumers. But do you think that there is a shared, more like global culture across crypto?
it sometimes feels that way, but it definitely feels that way more during the bull market. So
Mm,
I'm not 100% sure
yeah.
what the culture of crypto is. There's also been a lot of different waves. I think that the people are consistent, but even people's positions have changed a lot. And it's hard for me to point to a single point in time and be like, oh, this is consistent with now. Or like, I don't know if I could personally name a trait that is like indigenous to the crypto space.
I mean, just to jump around for a second, in your essay, so first of all, I feel like to call it an essay is like almost a pejorative for what this is. Yeah, I mean, you started writing this in 2016.
Yeah. The first version of it was kind of like just about the idea of lifestyle. Like, what is a lifestyle brand? At the time, I was really just trying to figure out how brands work, kind of infatuated with companies that I perceived as like understanding the logic of how like people form their identities better. Yeah, I was really trying to understand like how it is that like a brand becomes like central to somebody's identity, how products do that. So the first version of this, of me writing about this topic, was really just about that. But already at that time, I think I had developed some empathy for, because I was able to see it as more of a social learning process rather than some form of malnourished consumer identity formation. I was able to empathize with people in that position and like be less suspicious of it than I think many are.
So that was my experience. I've read this essay 3 times now, and like each time, that's always been my experience. It's like, yeah, I mean, it's an incredible piece of work. Yeah, and every time that I read it, I so appreciate the lack of moral judgment that you place on this moment in time. And especially like I'm a huge participant in this moment in time, both as a consumer and as someone who comes from a brand building background. I talk about my experience with my Quip toothbrush often, and how like the toothbrush itself, it's like a fine product. The branding is very millennial, but I am so dedicated to this idea that I am someone who intentionally carves out 3 minutes of my day, aspirationally twice a day, but at least once a day, where I just like engage in this really restorative act of wellness. That is my identity, and Quip enables that part of my identity. I think that that's a good thing for me. It's like
Yeah.
I think that there's ways in which, there's totally, conspicuous consumption and the way that we attach ourselves to brand and brand story that I think can become, to use your word, like malnourished. I think that's a really, really apt word. But I think that's what I really appreciated about this was I felt so seen. And also I felt really seen in my experience of lifestyle and this moment in time, but then also felt seen in how, like there's more, like I want more. And you say this in the piece, you're like, brands aren't going far enough. What do you mean by that?
It's probably my most dangerous claim.
Well, I feel like I saw you in that part of the essay, like kind of dancing around the weight of that.
I'm going to dance around it here too, because like my actual feeling is that like if you work at an agency and like you feel enabled by that, you are not structurally even in a position to enable that for your clients. And like you should know that because you work in an agency world and like you know exactly how constrained you are and how rarely clients are able to execute on your advice. So like just don't even try. That's my agency disclaimer.
I love it.
It's cool to hear your relationship with brushing your teeth and like how the product enables that to become even more of a ritual for you. The idea is really of like, okay, can you take that even further? Can that be even more meaningful? And like brushing your teeth may not be the tightest example, or may not be so straightforward, but how can that moment of like self-care and wellness be connected to other points and like parts of your life in a way that like enriches it with even more meaning? I think it's quite difficult to imagine how to do that, because as a consumer and like meaning maker, your moment of like brushing your teeth and like the idea of like wellness that you affiliate it with or whatnot is not really the same. I am guessing this about you. I could be wrong, tell me, but like it's probably not the same world of meaning as yourself as like a wine enjoyer or like cannabis consumer or other rituals that you have, which is definitely a different self than like the self that you're bringing to this podcast recording in your work at Seed Club, right? Mm-hmm. This is kind of what some people call like the atomized self, which is like the kind of characteristic quality of the modern subject, is that they have these things that are kind of meaningful, but the meanings are different worlds of meaning. They're different systems of meaning that are different parts of themselves and not integrated. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, like, oh, it's okay because like it's kind of cool that you can have those disparate things within yourself, and like maybe it's a little bit more experimental, but it also means that they aren't like integrated and like they don't enrich one another. So putting this idea of like going further in this large context of a self that's integrated, whose like meanings are integrated into like a larger world or system, sounds pretty difficult for like a single brand to achieve, I think. And once again, to anyone who's actually working on a brand and like thinks that they can accomplish that, like do not have that hubris. But this is why it all points to religion and sacredness as like the place where those meanings can come together and be made sense of.
I mean, to follow this idea of hubris, because you get at this a little bit in the essay too, and stick with me here for a second. Have you heard of this idea, brand flagship platform?
No. What's
okay,
that?
So this may or may not surprise you, but I have a subscription to Harvard Business Review.
Sure. Lots of people do. Go for it.
Go for it. I love that for you. And in one of their recent issues, they talked about this idea of a brand flagship platform. And it's supposed to be the sort of like answer to the brand aggregate platform. So things like an Amazon or a Walmart. And a brand flagship platform is basically when a brand, let's say like Nike, creates this this like more integrated experience that includes services, product, and content. So obviously the product, you know, they've got the sneakers and your gear, and then there's content. So, you know, as millennials, we're very familiar with content and the way in which brands engage in content marketing, which you also address in the piece. And then there's this idea of services, which is where I think I'm seeing, for instance, Nike in this one case study reaching for this idea of integration by bringing in like nutrition experts and like other third-party apps, so or other third-party brands, like I don't know, like Athletic Greens or something, and it's all kind of crashing into each other within this digital experience of an app. And I can't remember the name of the Nike app right now, but I'm sure lots of folks will know what it is. And yeah, and that there's also this idea of community, they call it crowdsourcing and crowd sending. So this idea of like crowdsourcing, that seems pretty obvious, but like this idea of crowd sending, which is where you then allow people to curate with each other and like create their own meaning with each other. And so you sort of like remove yourself as an intermediary within your platform. And so I see something like this, and I'm thinking this is them attempting to go further. You know, they're sitting there thinking we're not going far enough. We're going to go further with this brand flagship platform idea. At the same time, I hear you say really clearly, like, don't have the hubris to attempt that, right? And I somewhat agree. Like, as someone who has spent my life building brands and then thinking about what we're doing at Seed Club as well, and then I also think about what Nike is doing through this idea, this flagship platform. I guess I don't see that much difference from like what we're doing in crypto, right? There are some differences, but like let's just take a DAO, right? Like we're essentially crashing the idea of community, which you get at that word, and then we're crashing in product and then like media as a sort of like trinity of things that DAOs are engaged in. And so, yeah, like are we like kind of stepping out of our lane here in crypto by attempting to create these post-lifestyle cults or whatever the word is we want to use to qualify them? Like, is this a fool's errand? Like,
ooh, There's so much to respond to here. I think it's important to understand that most of the things that are happening in the crypto space are driven by the fact that the basic product is like tokens, it's currencies, and it comes out of these like sovereign monies ideas that were more prevalent in the earlier stages of crypto. I think to some degree there's a little bit of self-delusion going on about like what's a DAO because it's more that like we had Bitcoin, then we had a bunch of altcoins, then we had Ethereum, then we had ERC20 tokens. And like when the ICO phase was hitting, it was necessary to have a platform with which to talk about these tokens to like, shill them and like aggregate the community in one place. So we added Discords onto the stack. And, before you had Snapshot, you had stuff like SourceCred and like these bots to like attach token gating membership to a Discord. It seems to me that like the way DAO is often being used now is kind of like a post hoc justification for the stack that has come into being in order to shill tokens. Now there's all of these like kind of aspirational meanings that are projected on it that are not necessarily like DAO, and like the DAO stack was like not designed. It's more derived from the properties of like ICOs. This is kind of a hot take. I think it's
a really hot take.
I'm trying to get at the idea that like DAOs don't represent like an attempt to do anything. Maybe they do now, but they're not quite the same as these like brand platforms. They're more like an emergent shape.
You talk about FWB, and obviously you gave this talk at FWB, right?
Yeah.
So what's the through line with FWB and within this essay?
The through line with FWB, it's not so much of a through line. It more happens to be that FWB represents one of the most sophisticated attempts to create like an actual scene or subculture, even though it's based on this emergent design kit, you could say, that is the DAO stack, as it were. And you can see a lot of the weirdness, like the fact that like it isn't designed, because like normally when you do a scene, you don't capitalize the scene with venture capital. Like that doesn't really happen. So you can see that it's like more native. It's something that is trying to be built on top of this like, weird ICO legacy edifice. But, the people who are running it are like, big culture and entertainment people. And there's a genuine attempt to create something a little bit more lasting, which is just interesting. Can they do it?
Do you think they can?
I hope so.
You say this thing in the essay, you say, tech founders are not yet prepared to operate communities that are first and foremost places of moral influence.
Yeah.
And as someone who identifies, aspirationally as a tech founder, I found this very compelling because I agree.
Yeah.
And yet we still do it. And I guess, do you consider yourself a tech founder?
No, but I'm pretending to in public. So for anyone who's listening to this, like, please keep believing me when I say, yeah, I am.
And I can confirm. Toby is a tech founder in public.
For sure. I'm a founder in tech, but I don't think I'm a tech founder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, my experience at C Club and what I perceive to be your experience at Otherinternet as well is this idea that we are attempting to build spaces of positive moral influence, of social change, of just like positive impact on the world. And even if I totally feel underprepared, and I think that, you and I often talk about just like the challenges of being in varying positions of influence, just how much we're both like fumbling and yet we continue to aspire.
I don't know. I think a lot of founders genuinely have their hearts in the right place. Like they have good intentions, if not pure intentions. And nobody has like perfect intentions.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I was talking to a founder not that long ago who described, when I was asking about the chief sources of influence on them for like the cultural project that they are doing, they like pointed to their collegiate experience. And I actually know that their college, like I had visited that college and I think it's actually nice. Like they do have a good culture there, but I thought it was pretty sad that like a probably 40-year-old person like could only really point to that as like a generative and like life-giving space in their life. It indicated to me that like that person didn't have very clear sources of like moral influence or like examples of community leadership, what that tells me is like that person will not try to create that shape of an organization. Like they will probably try to create an organization that looks more like a business with a community element strapped on, like a classic Web 2.0 brand with a business or brand with a community. Or they will, if they are trying to create a more meaningful space, like there's a higher risk that they will create one that like just isn't so nourishing, maybe has bad vibes. And yeah, I think most people in my experience, my age, like just haven't experienced those types of spaces. On the other hand, it's so much easier to have these conversations with people who have spent a lot of time in religious community. It's way easier to engage with them on this level. And like people who have spent time in those spaces have a very rich vocabulary for different types of leadership, and like community design sounds so like weird and astroturfy, but like design principles for community and gathering, belonging. I think that's what I mean by like people who identify as tech founders like are not typically those who have had those types of experience. And now, it's hot to do community, so that's what we're going to do. But like you haven't had those experiences, and it's likely that the person who you're hiring to be your community manager like hasn't either. This is not a job that you farm out to somebody. It's like it's got to be part of the culture from the start if you are trying to operate a space that wants to become that meaningful to people.
That's so precise. That like in some ways, this idea of being a tech founder, being a founder in tech, however you want to describe yourself or myself, like it's almost like in conflict to a sense of like religiosity or even, one click further, like spirituality.
Yeah. And
when you're talking about the like ineffable qualities of someone who has spent meaningful time in a religious community, I actually have not spent considerable time in a religious community. I was raised Catholic, but didn't have a super great time in that experience, and so sort of like fled that world pretty hard. And yeah, but have been someone who's been in search of that sense of, I see the deep resonance that people have within their religion, and that is very compelling. And so And to me, what I see is like and you get at this too in the essay. Like this, there's those rituals, there's practices, and there's just like connection and a sense of like vulnerability within that connection, and curiosity, and so I guess when you think about people in tech who are doing this thing where we're especially in the DAO space at the intersection of tokens, like we see tokens as a really optimistic technology, like something that can potentially provide this additional layer of like attachment and connection for people around a shared purpose, particularly at the intersection of like value creation and ownership and value flow. But I think for those of us who are pursuing this like fundamentally speculative path, right? Like we don't know how this is going to go, but we're doing it because we fundamentally believe in the optimism here. And what are the pieces that are really critical for us to hold out as we're, sort of on this impossible pursuit? You've run these cult workshops. Maybe you can say more about those, but like what are some of the through lines that you've seen?
What did you mean by pieces that we should hold out?
Yeah, the things that we shouldn't lose sight of, right?
Things we shouldn't lose sight of are people, whether as children or adults. We are constantly learning. We are never not learning something. Through all the activities and communities that we engage in, we're learning certain things about ourselves, about the roles that we play and are expected to play. As community leaders, like we're being watched. So a lot of like what we're saying is teaching others, even when we're not intending to instruct. People learn things that like we're not intending them to learn, such as like you can learn in a dysfunctional workplace. Like what you can learn is I'm not worthy of being given responsibility for this or that type of task or something. Or what I've learned is I don't need to know for this organization to function. I don't need to know why I'm being given this responsibility, or why it's important. I just need to do it. I think there is a lot to understand about how people are working in these decentralized ecosystems. I mean, we have deep experience in Uniswap, and I think what people have learned there is like only reproducing like the most dysfunctional organization when it comes to these things where there's moral life involved. Yeah, I think it's important for, I don't know, this is kind of my design principle, but like I want to be part of spaces where people feel empowered and able to have spiritual experiences that are valid, that are viewed as valid by those spaces. And when somebody has an experience, your experience can't be wrong. It can't be invalid because it's just your experience. It is. But if you have an experience and like somebody denies you some aspect of that experience, it says like it's wrong or incorrect, then like you're learning something about like what is permitted and not permitted in that space. For example, if FWB were to like not be receptive to like forms of critique, then like it would be training people to not express some part that like might actually be very useful for FWB to have as like part of its culture. Yeah, so I think just like understanding what people are learning in a given space, even if that space doesn't have any concretely designed doctrines, especially if it doesn't have concretely designed doctrines, it's important to understand like what's being taught, I would put in scare quotes.
I think that gets at it, that like in spaces where there aren't clearly defined doctrines, which let's just, I feel like the whole DAO space is that right now, that it's really critical that we are just we're really attuned to the things that are being quote unquote taught. And like, as a parent, I think about that all the time. Just like my kids, they're just watching me. They're watching me. They're listening, even when I don't think they are. And there's just so much that they're absorbing. And maybe that's more of a better word, just like the level of absorption that's happening. And because it happens everywhere and all the time in these communities that we have influence over, that we're leading. Or Toby, before we go, I'm curious, ever since your essay, you've had this real impact on the Seed Club ecosystem. You've gotten many shout outs in our current cohort sessions, and people are looking to you for thought leadership. And I want to know who you look to. Who are the people that influence you?
Honestly, one of my heroes, still Venkatesh Rao. He's not as popular as he was before because he doesn't write these like big flashy pieces anymore. But if anything, like he's only gotten more on point. And like continues to think in really interesting and inventive ways, continues to have his finger on the pulse. Venkat is very averse to like exercising his own moral influence on others. Other people who I look to are, I would say that like my colleagues like continue to be an inspiration to me. Aaron Lewis continues to be like a huge influence on me. And aside from our intellectual partnership, is actively like creating these wholesome spaces. I think right now I'm most inspired by people who are not writing, but whose intellectual practice is like married to the type of spaces that they are able to create and are like living out their work in some fashion. I also want to like point to Teal Process and Company. I don't know if you know about them, but they're just the most inspiring and creative organization that I know. And then I also, because I had a dream about him the other night, I also want to give a shout out to Charles Taylor, the philosopher. He's like 90-year-old Catholic who is just like one of the giants of contemporary moral philosophy and has been really influential on me, both in my development as a thinker and like in terms of like what I pay attention to, like the moral life.
Well, Charles Taylor, you got a shout out.
Charles Taylor, the legend.
The legend.
Charles Taylor listening to Seed Club?
We'll try and get to him. Yeah. Toby, where can people find you and Otherinternet on the internet?
The Otherinternet website is http://otherinter.net. My website, my personal website is tobyshorin.com, and my blog website, on which Life After Lifestyle and many older essays are published, is subpixel.space. And I wonder if I have another good website. I have a big arena presence, so you can check out my arena.
It's a good one. Toby, thanks for doing this with me. Thanks for coming on the pod.
Thank you, Steph. Only for you.
Thanks for listening to Inside Seed Club. If you liked what you heard today, please rate us and leave us a review. This helps other Web3 builders discover these insights. Subscribe to Inside Seed Club to get the latest episode dropped right into your feed. And let us know what you think on Twitter. We're at Seed Club HQ. See you on the internet.